It is 5:36 in the afternoon, Good Friday, March 27th, 1964. On the waterfront at Valdez, Alaska, a cargo ship called the SS Chenega sits moored at the city dock, carrying supplies she delivered that afternoon. The mountains surrounding the inlet are white with winter. The water in Port Valdez is calm. The air is cold and clear. 2 crew members on deck have taken out 8mm cameras, filming the harbor, the mountains, the light off the water, the way men sometimes do when there is nothing more pressing to do. On the dock itself, a 27-year-old longshoreman named Jerry Zook is finishing his shift. He is to be married the following week. Then the ground moves. Not a tremor, not a shake. The ground moves the way water moves when something enormous rises beneath it. A deep rolling heave that begins underfoot and spreads in every direction at once. And then it keeps going. 10 seconds, 20, 30, a minute. Buildings crack. Windows shatter in succession down the length of the street. The pavement buckles and rises in slow, impossible waves. The Chenega's stern begins to rise at a sharp angle, bow going down, propellers swinging into the cold air. And beneath the harbor, beneath the dock and the waterfront of the entire city, something is happening that no one above the surface can see. The seafloor is beginning to fail. The shaking will last 4 minutes and 38 seconds total. By the time it stops, the strongest earthquake ever recorded in United States history will have reshaped 200,000 square kilometers of the Earth's surface, erased towns from the map, and set in motion waves that will keep killing people across more than 1,600 miles of Pacific coastline. Almost none of them will be warned in time. If you want to understand not just what happened, but why the warnings failed, and what that failure means right now for millions of people living above the same kind of fault, subscribe to Epicenter Files. This is exactly what we do. The standard account of Good Friday, 1964, tends to stop at the statistics. A magnitude 9.2 earthquake, the strongest ever recorded in North American history. More than 130 people dead, $500 million in damage. Those numbers are real and they are staggering. But they don't tell you what the ground actually did. And they don't tell you what was known before it happened. They don't explain why the town of Valdez was built on ground that an engineer had declared dangerous 65 years earlier. They don't explain why the warning system built specifically to prevent this kind of catastrophe was structurally incapable of protecting the communities that died first. And they don't explain why the gap that made those deaths inevitable still exists today, directly beneath the coastline of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, this story is not history. It is present tense. Now let us go back to the beginning, because the earthquake did not begin on March 27th, 1964. The town of Valdez, Alaska, in the winter of 1964, was not large, but it was essential. Nestled at the head of Port Valdez, a deep-water fjord at the northeastern corner of Prince William Sound, it was the only ice-free port in south-central Alaska, accessible by road. Everything the surrounding region needed, every ton of freight and fuel and supplies, came through Valdez. It was a longshoreman's town, a shipping town, and in 1964, its population sat at just under 1,000 people. What those people did not know was that the ground beneath their feet was not ground in the conventional sense. The original townsite of Valdez had been built on the seaward edge of a large glacial outwash delta, a broad, flat wedge of material deposited by meltwater from the Valdez Glacier over thousands of years. It looked and felt like solid land. It was, in fact, a deep layer of water-saturated silt, fine sand, and gravel, perched at the edge of a fjord that dropped sharply to the seafloor below. In 1899, an engineer named Edward Gillete, working on a surveying expedition through the area, had looked at this delta and written a warning in his official report. There was danger, Gillete wrote, at any time of having the buildings swept into the bay by swift and quickly changing channels formed by the numerous streams flowing from uncertain and ever-changing parts of the Valdez Glacier. No one moved the town. By 1964, that warning had been sitting in a document for 65 years, specific, accurate, and entirely forgotten. On the afternoon of March 27th, the SS Chenega had arrived at the Valdez city dock shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, loaded with supplies. Captain Merrill Stewart had brought her in without difficulty. His crew had settled in after the passage, and 2 of the men, with nothing urgent to attend to, had taken out their 8mm cameras and were filming the harbor. On the dock below, Jerry Zook was finishing his shift. The afternoon was cold and still, and completely unremarkable. There was no reason, standing on that dock on the afternoon of Good Friday, to think of anything but the end of the working day. 350 miles from Valdez, on Evans Island in Prince William Sound, the village of Chenega occupied a narrow strip of land at the water's edge. It was a small community, 75 people, predominantly Sugpiaq, the indigenous people of the Sound, who had lived on these islands and waters for generations. The village was built the way coastal Sugpiaq communities had always been built, close to the sea that fed it, within reach of the fishing grounds and hunting waters, surrounded by mountains that rose steeply from the fjord on every side. Nicholas Kompkoff, Chenega's chief and a seal hunter, had spent his entire life on that water. He had read the Sound in every season and every weather, its color changes, its tide patterns, the way it moved in different winds. On the afternoon of March 27th, he was near his stilt house at the edge of the harbor. The Sound was calm. There was nothing unusual about the light or the water or the air. Nothing that would have drawn a second look from a man who had looked at that water every day of his life. 300 miles to the northwest, Anchorage was in the middle of a post-war expansion that had transformed it into the largest city in Alaska. New subdivisions had spread outward through the 1950s and early 1960s. And by 1964, the population was approaching 100,000 people. On the bluffs above Knik Arm, one of the arms of Cook Inlet on the city's western edge, a residential neighborhood called Turnagain Heights had been developed in recent years. It had wide views of the water and a sense of elevation and spaciousness that made it one of the more desirable addresses in the city. Beneath its foundations and streets, buried under the ordinary surfaces of a new suburb, lay a deposit of fine-grained marine silt that geologists called Bootlegger Cove Clay, wet, layered sediment deposited beneath an ancient sea, now invisible under Anchorage's sidewalks and foundation slabs. No one in Turnagain Heights was thinking about what lay beneath their foundations on the afternoon of Good Friday. Neither was anyone in Valdez. Neither was anyone in Chenega. In the fishing villages scattered across the islands of Prince William Sound, in the inlet communities along the Gulf Coast, in the harbors and small towns of south-central Alaska, the afternoon of March 27, 1964, was cold and quiet and entirely ordinary. People were finishing work, thinking about supper, going about the end of a long week. They were not thinking about what the ground beneath all of them shared, a common origin, a common geological situation that, in a matter of minutes, was going to make itself impossible to ignore. They could not have been, because understanding that situation required a framework for reading the Earth that, in 1964, did not yet fully exist. The science that would explain what was about to happen had not yet been written. The people in its path had no way of knowing what they were standing on. And that absence of knowledge, not negligence, not failure, simply the frontier of what humanity understood about the planet it lived on, is part of what made the disaster as devastating as it became. At 5:35 in the afternoon, they had approximately 60 seconds left of that ordinary day. To understand what happened in Alaska on March 27, 1964, you have to go beneath the floor of the Gulf of Alaska. Far offshore, hidden under miles of cold water, the Pacific tectonic plate has been moving for millions of years, grinding northwestward, pressing beneath the lighter North American plate at an oblique angle. This process is called subduction. The oceanic plate, denser and heavier, dives downward under the continent's edge and descends into the Earth's interior. At the boundary between these two plates, the interface where their surfaces are in direct contact, they do not slide smoothly. They lock. Friction holds them together, while the deeper portions of both plates continue their slow motion. The leading edge of the North American plate is steadily, invisibly being bent downward and compressed, dragged by the plate beneath it, storing energy the way a bent spring stores energy. year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The process produces no signal at the surface. It simply accumulates. In 1964, the theory of plate tectonics had not yet been established as scientific consensus. The idea that the Earth's outer shell was divided into great rigid plates that moved, collided, and ground beneath each other. That ocean floors were consumed at subduction zones, while continents rode above, was being actively debated in geology departments around the world. It was gaining traction, but it had not yet been confirmed by the kind of large-scale empirical evidence that rewrites textbooks. The concept of a locked subduction interface, a zone where two plates were pressing against each other, accumulating centuries of elastic strain, waiting for the friction to fail. There was not something any scientist in 1964 could have pointed to on a map with certainty and said, "This is where the next great earthquake will begin." The tools to make that identification did not exist. The framework to interpret such data, even if the tools had existed, was still being assembled. They understood that Alaska was seismically active. They did not yet understand, with the precision the situation required, the full mechanism operating beneath their feet. And they had a warning system. After a tsunami generated by an Aleutian Islands earthquake struck Hilo, Hawaii in April of 1946, killing 159 people with no advance warning, the United States established a seismic sea wave warning system for the Pacific Basin. The system worked by detecting large earthquakes, estimating their tsunami-generating potential, and transmitting alerts to coastal communities before the waves arrived. For the threat it was designed to address, a distant tsunami crossing hundreds or thousands of miles of open ocean, it worked. A wave from Alaska needed 4 or more hours to reach Hawaii. That travel time was the system's window, time to detect, analyze, issue the alert, move it through the notification chain, and allow populations to evacuate. The system had one structural flaw it had never been forced to confront at catastrophic scale. It was architecturally invisible to a wave that did not need to cross an ocean. A wave generated not by distant tectonic displacement, but by the immediate collapse of the seafloor directly beneath a harbor. A submarine landslide. A local wave whose distance to shore was measured in feet rather than miles, and whose arrival time was measured in minutes rather than hours. In Chenega, the wave generated by submarine landslides in Prince William Sound would arrive 4 minutes after the earthquake began. Not 4 hours, 4 minutes. No seismograph reading, no alert transmission, no notification chain on Earth operates in 4 minutes. The warning system had never been tested against a threat this close to shore. Beneath the Gulf of Alaska, the locked interface had been accumulating strain for approximately 3 centuries. It had been holding since roughly the year 1700. On the afternoon of Good Friday, at 22.5 kilometers below the surface of Prince William Sound, it stopped holding. The rupture begins deep beneath Prince William Sound and propagates outward along the plate interface, not along a single line, but across an enormous zone of contact stretching approximately 800 kilometers from Prince William Sound westward along the Gulf of Alaska. The North American plate, bent downward and compressed over centuries of locked subduction, releases. It springs back upward. In areas closest to the fault's rebound, the seafloor and the land above it rise by as much as 10 meters. Other areas, pulled down in the adjacent subsidence zone, drop by nearly 3. The displacement moves the water column above it. At 5:36 in the afternoon, the ground begins to shake. In Anchorage, the shaking is violent and sustained. Buildings built to Alaska's seismic codes begin to show damage under a motion that keeps going past 30 seconds, past 60, past 90. Beneath the residential bluffs of Turnagain Heights, the Bootlegger Cove Clay reaches its failure threshold. The clay, water-saturated and fine-grained, loses its structural integrity under the sustained cyclic shaking and liquefies. The ground above it loses its foundation and begins to slide toward nickarm and great irregular blocks, each section separating from its neighbor along plains of liquid clay and moving at its own speed toward the water. In Valdez Harbor, Captain Merrill Stewart has made his way to the bridge of the Chenega when the full force of the shaking reaches the ship. From the bridge, he watches the waterfront, the city dock, The buildings along the harbor front compact, slump, and slide into the bay. Below the harbor, the glacial delta that Edward Gillete had flagged 65 years before is doing exactly what saturated, fine-grained sediment does under sustained, rapid shaking. It is liquefying. 98 million cubic yards of material begin to slide off the shelf of the harbor floor into the deep water of Port Valdez. The slide is not slow. It takes the dock with it, the pilings, the waterfront infrastructure, and the men who are standing on it. Jerry Zook is 27 years old. Gloria Day, watching from higher ground near the shore, sees the Chenega's stern rise sharply out of the water, the bow going down, the propellers turning in the cold air above the surface. The shaking has been going on for approximately 2 minutes. It has more than 2 minutes left. There is a version of this disaster in which the warning system works, in which a signal travels fast enough from the failing seafloor to the people on the dock above it. There is no such version. The failure of the delta and the arrival of the local wave were, in physical terms, simultaneous. The chain of events that produced the wave was in motion before the wave existed, and the distance between the source of the failure and the men above it was not a gap that any alert system on Earth could bridge. The deeper question the disaster forces us to ask is not about the warning system. It is about the 65-year-old written warning sitting in a surveying report that no one had acted on. What would it have taken to turn that warning into a decision to move a working town? And who was responsible for that decision not being made? Drop your answer in the comments below, because the version of that question that applies to the Pacific Northwest coast is not historical. It is happening right now. The ground under Turnagain Heights is going. 130 acres of residential Anchorage, the bluff, the streets, the homes built on it, has cracked apart and is sliding toward Nick Arm in great irregular blocks of liquefied clay. 75 homes are carried toward the inlet. The slide continues moving for 90 seconds after the earthquake itself stops shaking. 4 people die in it. The neighborhood that had a wide view of the water on the morning of Good Friday has become part of that water by the afternoon. In Valdez Harbor, the local wave generated by the submarine landslide beneath the dock surges inward as the waterfront collapses. The SS Chenega is thrown, her hull driven toward the exposed harbor floor as the water surges, drains, and surges again. Through all of it, the 2 crew members on deck keep filming. Their 8mm cameras keep running through everything the harbor does. The footage they capture becomes some of the only moving visual record of the Valdez disaster as it unfolds. Captain Stewart navigates the Chenega to deeper water. The ship survives. 32 people in Valdez do not. The dock is gone. The waterfront is gone. And Jerry Zook is not among the recovered dead, because his body is not recovered. It will not be. In Prince William Sound, the tectonic rupture of the plate interface is also generating a second kind of wave. Not the local, landslide-driven wave that struck Valdez, but a basin-wide tsunami created by the upward displacement of the seafloor across 800 kilometers of the plate boundary. In open water, it is nearly invisible. Against a coastline, it will be something else entirely. But that wave is still traveling. Right now, the more immediate threat is already arriving at Evans Island. Nicholas Kompkoff is at the water's edge in Chenega when the earthquake begins. He has felt earthquakes before. This is nothing like that. The shaking goes on. And then, as he looks out at the sound, he sees something he has never seen in his life. The water disappears. Not recedes, disappears. The harbor drains in seconds, the sea floor surfacing briefly under open sky. He knows, with the certainty of someone who has spent his whole life reading that water, what is gathering on the other side of the horizon. He turns and runs. He calls to his daughters, pushes them toward the hillside, toward the high ground, toward the church that sits 100 feet above the village. He pushes them to move faster. The wave arrives before all of them reach safety. Kompkoff grabs the 2 daughters closest to him, carries one under each arm, and keeps running. 2 daughters are taken by the water. The wave reaches Chenega 4 minutes after the earthquake began. 4 minutes, not hours. It destroys every building in the village except the schoolhouse on the hill, which was built 100 feet above sea level. 23 of the village's 75 people are killed, nearly 1/3 of the entire community. Chenega, as a place, as a village, as a home that generations had built and lived in, is gone in the span of a few minutes on a Friday afternoon in late March. No warning had been issued. No warning was possible. The wave arrived in 4 minutes, and there was no chain in existence capable of running faster than that. The Pacific-wide tectonic tsunami was still traveling south. The tectonic tsunami travels at the speed of a commercial aircraft across the open Pacific. In deep water, it is nearly invisible, a low, long swell that a ship would not feel passing beneath it. It reaches the Hawaiian Islands, it reaches Japan, and it runs southward down the Pacific coast of North America toward California. The city of Crescent City sits in the far northwestern corner of California, in a shallow bay that is unusually effective at amplifying incoming waves. The city had been struck by tsunamis before and was broadly understood among emergency planners to be at elevated risk. The Pacific Warning System had been functioning on the night of March 27th. It detected the Alaska earthquake, assessed its tsunami potential, and began transmitting alerts. The California Civil Defense Office received information from the Pacific Warning Center at 9:30 in the evening, Pacific Standard Time. It did not issue alerts to county level until 11:08 that night, 1 hour and 38 minutes after receiving the warning. By the time the alert reached Crescent City, the first wave was already approaching. The first wave struck the waterfront and caused limited damage. The second was small. The third caused real harm to the harbor front. Broken windows, displaced vehicles, water across the street, but nothing catastrophic. People who had evacuated to higher ground began to conclude that the threat had been overstated. Some returned to the waterfront to check on their property and their boats. Some had never left at all. The situation seemed manageable. The warnings, in the light of what had actually arrived, seemed like an overreaction. Between the third and fourth waves, the harbor drained completely. The seafloor was briefly exposed in the darkness, lit by the lamps along the waterfront. Then, the fourth wave came. It crested at nearly 21 feet and swept through 29 city blocks, 2/3 of Crescent City. 11 people died. 24 were injured. The fourth wave was larger than the previous 3 combined, and it found people on the waterfront who were there because the first 3 waves had seemed survivable. Those people were not being irrational. They were responding to the evidence available to them, and that evidence was incomplete. The warning system could say a tsunami was coming. It could not say the third wave was not the last wave. It could not say that when the harbor floor appears beneath you in the darkness, that is the moment to run. That specific knowledge, not that a warning had been issued, but what the behavior of the water itself was telling them, had to be preloaded into the community before the event. It was not there. More than 130 people died in the earthquake and its tsunamis across Alaska and California. Most of them did not die in the shaking. They died in what followed it. In some cases, the warning was never possible. In others, the warning existed but could not travel fast enough, or arrived without the specific information a coastal population needed to act correctly. The ground stopped moving at 5:40 in the afternoon, 4 minutes and 38 seconds after it started. The dying went on for hours. In the days after the earthquake, the scale of what had happened became visible in pieces. In Anchorage, the Turnagain Heights neighborhood was unrecognizable. 130 acres of the bluff above Knickarm were not damaged, they were gone. 12 million cubic yards of sand, clay, and gravel now sat between the former bluff edge and the inlet. 75 families had lost their homes. 4 people were dead. The neighborhood would never be rebuilt on that ground. In Chenega, the silence that settled after the wave was not the silence of a community gathering itself. It was the silence of a place that no longer existed. The houses, the boats on the beach, the community hall, the paths worn into the hillside by generations of feet, all of it was gone. The schoolhouse stood alone on its hill, intact, empty, surrounded by water and debris and the absence of everything else. Of the 23 people killed at Chenega, many were children. Nicholas Kompkoff had carried 2 daughters out of the water. 2 others were gone. He spent more than 2 decades watching the community of Chenega try to reconstitute itself in displacement, scattered to Tadadlek, to Cordova, to Anchorage, living in other people's places without a home ground. He trained in Sitka. He earned his high school diploma. He helped found a parish. In 1971, he became a priest. It was not until 1984, 20 years after the wave, that a new village, Chenega Bay, was established on a different island in Prince William Sound. The community that had existed at Evans Island was never rebuilt there. That ground was not reoccupied. In Valdez, the United States Geological Survey assessment was swift and unambiguous. Geologists Henry Coulter and Ralph Migliaccio examined the old town site and concluded in their official report, the Valdez waterfront has proven to be unstable under seismic conditions. They recommended relocation. Old Valdez was condemned. The entire town was rebuilt approximately 4 miles to the north, on stable ground. The original site, the glacial delta that Edward Gillete had warned about in 1899, was abandoned. It remains abandoned. Jerry Zook's body was never recovered. Across the full affected region, the physical scale of the earthquake's work was almost impossible to comprehend. More than 200,000 square kilometers of the Earth's surface had permanently changed during those 4 minutes and 38 seconds. Sections of the Alaskan coastline were now meters higher than they had been the previous afternoon. Other sections were lower, with forests drowned in seawater that had flooded in permanently. The total property damage was estimated at $500 million, roughly $3,750 million in present-day values. Within the first 24 hours, 28 significant aftershocks followed the main event. 10 of them exceeded magnitude 6.0. The ground beneath south-central Alaska was still moving. What remained, after the shaking and the waves and the long count of the dead, was the question that every disaster of this scale eventually forces. What did this teach us, and did we learn it? In the weeks after the earthquake, a geologist from the United States Geological Survey named George Plafker traveled to the coast of south-central Alaska and began walking the shoreline. What he was mapping was deformation, a coherent, large-scale pattern of vertical displacement that the earthquake had produced across the Alaskan coast. Land had risen sharply in some places, dropped in others. Barnacles and tide pools that should have been at the waterline were now 10 meters above it. Forests that had stood on solid ground were drowning in salt water. The pattern was not random. It had a shape, and that shape was the key. When Plafker sat down to interpret it, he found that only one physical mechanism could account for what he had documented. The earthquake had been caused by a gently dipping thrust fault, the interface between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate, along which the oceanic plate had been subducting beneath the continent. The North American Plate, bent downward and compressed over centuries of locked contact, had snapped back upward when the interface finally failed. The elastic rebound of that release was the earthquake. The pattern of uplift and subsidence across hundreds of miles of Alaskan coastline was its fingerprint. In 1969, Plafker published his findings as a United States Geological Survey professional paper, Tectonics of the March 27, 1964 Alaska Earthquake. The paper documented the crustal deformation and fault mechanics in detail that had never been produced for an earthquake of this scale. The paper was published at a moment when the theory of plate tectonics was still gaining mainstream acceptance, and the evidence from the 1964 earthquake, captured by more than 70 newly installed worldwide standardized seismograph network stations in the first major earthquake to be fully recorded by a global seismic network, became some of the most powerful empirical support yet gathered for the plate tectonics paradigm. Plafker's work did not by itself prove plate tectonics, but it provided the kind of large-scale, undeniable field evidence that accelerated the theory's acceptance as the governing framework for understanding the Earth. Every large subduction zone earthquake since, the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, the 2011 earthquake off the coast of Japan, which generated a magnitude 9.1 rupture and killed nearly 20,000 people, has been understood through the lens of what was learned in Alaska in 1964. The practical changes that followed were significant and real. Anchorage rebuilt with improved standards for construction on liquefiable soils. Valdez was moved to stable ground. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration expanded its tsunami warning infrastructure. Seismic monitoring networks across Alaska were improved. The earthquake changed how the world reads the ground. And yet the problem that 1964 identified most clearly was not solved by any of it. The near-field tsunami, the wave that reached Chenega in 4 minutes, the wave at Valdez generated directly beneath the harbor, is not a problem that faster warning technology has closed, because the physics of the problem do not allow it. The only protection that works in 4 minutes is the knowledge already present in a coastal population before the earthquake begins. That when the ground shakes for more than 20 seconds and you are near the water, you do not wait for any signal. You move. The earthquake itself is the only warning that arrives in time. That knowledge had to be in Chenega before the wave arrived. It was not. And in the communities that now sit above the next locked subduction zone on the Pacific coast, that knowledge, not the technology, not the alert system, but the preloaded human understanding of what to do with 4 minutes, is still the gap that matters most. The Cascadia subduction zone has been locked for approximately 326 years, off the coast of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Beneath miles of cold Pacific water, the Cascadia subduction zone has been accumulating strain since at least the year 1700. Geologists know when it last failed. The evidence is preserved in the coastal wetlands of Washington state. Stands of trees killed by sudden subsidence, drowned in salt water, their trunks still rooted in the mud more than 3 centuries later. Scientists identified those ghost forests for what they were, the signature of a great coastal earthquake, partly because of the scientific framework that the 1964 Alaska event helped establish. The Cascadia Fault last ruptured on January 26, 1700, in an event estimated at approximately magnitude 9. The tsunami it generated crossed the Pacific and was recorded in Japan. That rupture was 326 years ago. The Cascadia subduction zone is the same type of locked plate interface that failed beneath Prince William Sound on Good Friday, 1964. When it ruptures, the shaking will be comparable in magnitude. The near-field timing problem, the same problem that gave the people of Chenega 4 minutes and the people on the Valdez dock less than that, applies in full to every coastal community within 50 miles of the Cascadia rupture zone. The warning systems built since 1964 are faster. Evacuation routes are being mapped and marked. But the physics of the problem have not changed. For the communities closest to that rupture, when it comes, the earthquake will be the warning. If you want to understand more of the disasters that reshaped the science, the preparedness, and the communities that lived and did not live through them, subscribe to Epicenter Files. Every episode follows the evidence to the part of the story the standard account leaves out. Tonight, somewhere along the Pacific Northwest coastline, the Cascadia interface is locked. It has been locked for 326 years. The strain is still accumulating.